Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare and this is the first tutorial in the series where I'm teaching you how to knit. So I introduced this video series in my previous video, which I'll link up in the corner of the screen right now. And basically the idea is that you can either watch this video as part of the series where we knit a scarf and each block of the scarf is a different stitch pattern. This video, you're at the first one, so this is the first block. Or if you're just interested in learning how to knit and cast on, you can also just watch this video in isolation. So first up, as I just mentioned, in this video, I'm going to be taking you through how to work a backward loop cast on and then working the knit stitch. If you're interested in any of the materials or anything like that I'm using, be sure to check out that first video that I posted. So in this first video, we're going to be learning the cast on and then the knit stitch. So in my little sample here, we're going to be working through this first square of the pattern. Now this cast on that I'm going to be showing you, it starts with a slip knot and then it's called the backward loop cast on. And depending on the size you're knitting, I'm going to be knitting the kid size. So I'm going to cast on 22 stitches. You can adjust it to make it wider or narrower if you'd prefer. So the kid size, as shown here, has 22 stitches. And it measures just over 5 inches wide. Mine's about 5¼ inches wide. So that is 22 stitches right there. So let's start with the cast on and that slip knot first. So I'm going to move my knitting needles to the side for a moment. And I'm just going to unwind a bit of this yarn. Let me find the start of it. So to do the slip knot first, I just need a little bit of yarn. So maybe about 8 to 10 inches there. I just estimate. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that over my left hand. So the ball of yarn is further away from me. And this is called the yarn tail that's closest to me. Now I'm going to grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers. My pointer finger is still pointed out. And now I want to take this strand of yarn that's attached to the ball up above, and I'm going to wrap it around my pointer finger. So when I wrap it around my pointer finger, I'm going to go up to the top, then back behind down to the bottom, up to the top again, back behind down to the bottom, up to the top again, back down to the bottom. Now that I'm here, I'm going to grab onto that second strand with my bottom 3 fingers as well. So when I look at my hand, I have basically like 2 full loops around my finger and then one kind of like a half loop here. Now the way the slip knot is worked is we're going to rearrange these top 2 loops. So first I'm going to grab onto the second loop or the center loop there, and I'm going to move it up closer to the top of my pointer finger. Then I'm going to grab onto the new second loop, and now I'm going to move that one up towards the top of my pointer finger. And now I'm going to grab onto that newest second loop. And when I grab onto this one, I'm just going to slide it off of my finger. And what I've created there is a slip knot. Now when I have the slip knot, I'm going to place it. You can kind of see how the pieces of yarn come out opposite sides of the slip knot. So the part attached to the ball of yarn is going to be further away. The working yarn is going to be closest to me. And then I'm just going to grab one of my knitting needle points and I want to slide it onto the slip knot. So I'm going to take one knitting needle point, point it over towards the left, go right into the center of that slip knot, and then I'm just going to gently pull on the tail of yarn to secure it on my knitting needle. And when I secure it on there, I want to make sure it can still slide around easily. So I don't want it too tight. I also don't want it too loose. So you can see that it's pretty snug on there. A little bit of an opening there, and that's perfect. So that was our slip knot, and that also counts as the first stitch. So now what we need to do is we need to continue casting on the rest of the stitches that we need. So the way we're going to cast on is, again, still holding the single knitting needle in my right hand, and I'm just kind of grabbed onto it right now. is I'm going to slide this slip knot a little bit closer to the point up at the top. And now I'm going to grab onto that tail of yarn with my right hand as well. So it's kind of like I'm holding onto the knitting needle and that tail of yarn at the same time. And I like to hold that first stitch in place just so it doesn't go anywhere with the pointer finger of my right hand. Now to cast on more stitches, I'm going to take my left hand and I'm going to put it behind the strand of yarn that's attached to the ball. Now again, I'm going to grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers, so it should be looking similar to that slip knot. And now I'm going to take my pointer finger, take it underneath that strand towards myself, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. So to show that one more time, I'm grabbing onto the strand with my left hand, grabbing onto the bottom with the strand with my bottom 3 fingers, taking my pointer finger down below the strand, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top again. Now I'm going to take that loop that's wrapped around my finger and I'm going to take the knitting needle, slide it under that loop, and now slide the loop off of my finger and onto the knitting needle. Then I'm just going to gently tug on the yarn so it tightens. Again, I can still move around the stitches. And that is the next stitch casted on. So I'm going to repeat the steps. I kind of already have it started here on my left hand. So now I'm just going to take my pointer finger of my left hand, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top again. So I created a new loop around my finger. Take the knitting needle, go under the loop, slide it off your finger onto the knitting needle, and gently tug it. Again, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. Slide it off of your pointer finger onto the knitting needle. And you will notice that as I'm doing this, I'm not really holding the yarn too tightly. That way it can move freely through my left hand. So it's nice and loose over there. And I'm just taking essentially more yarn from the ball of yarn each time. Now, if you ever drop the strand like I just did, you can easily reset up again. So I'm just gonna take my left hand behind the yarn, grab onto it again, and now I'm basically gonna do 2 of the loops. So down the bottom, up the front to the top. Then again, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. And now I can start casting on again. So I'm gonna keep on casting on until I have the number of stitches needed. So for me, that's going to be 22 stitches. And again, the slip knot does count as one of those stitches. So now I have my 22 stitches cast on. And what I need to do to actually begin knitting across is I'm gonna take my knitting needle and I'm gonna flip it over so now that knitting needle point is going over towards the right. This little yarn tail, you don't wanna do anything with, you just wanna leave it hanging from your work. And at the very end, we'll weave it in. So you can see this is the scarf I knit before. That's my cast on tail, just still hanging out there. At the end, we'll use one of those tapestry needles to weave it in. Just wanna make sure you aren't knitting with it along the way. So the way I'm gonna grab my knitting needle is I'm actually gonna hold it basically on top of where the knitting is, kind of up close to where my point is. And again, this point is going over towards the right. I'm holding this knitting needle in my left hand. And I'm gonna grab my second knitting needle here with my right hand. And again, I'm gonna hold this one pretty close to the top. So if I'm working a knit stitch, I'm gonna be going into the bottom of the first stitch on the left knitting needle. And when I go into the bottom of that stitch, I'm going from the left side over towards the right side. So I just go through the first stitch underneath of my left knitting needle. And now when I wrap my yarn, I'm kind of pinching that knitting needle up against my left one just to hold it in place, so that way my right hand becomes free. I'm gonna take this yarn and wrap it in between, going over towards the left, then pulling it snug in between the two knitting needles. And now I wanna slide that knitting needle down towards the point and pull that loop through the loop. Now I'm gonna slide that stitch off of my left knitting needle. So I just knit that first stitch. So I'm gonna show that a whole bunch more times, nice and slow, just so you can catch it. Now to work the next stitch, again, I'm gonna go into the base of the next stitch on my left knitting needle, starting at the left, going over towards the right, underneath of my left knitting needle. And now I'm gonna take the yarn attached to the ball. I'm gonna go over towards the left, underneath that knitting needle, pull it between the two knitting needles, pull it nice and snug. Then I wanna use that right knitting needle to pull that loop through, then slide the stitch off of my left knitting needle. Now again, I'm gonna go into the base of the next stitch, going from left to right, wrap my yarn underneath, then up in between, pull it nice and snug, pull the loop through the stitch, slide the stitch off. Going from left to right. I feel like the hardest part is probably where you have to drop the knitting needle here. So it does help with these longer ones that you can just rest them on the table. So if I zoom out all the way here, each time I'm stopping, I'm just resting it on the table, wrapping that yarn around, pulling it snug, pulling through. Then for the next one, put in my knitting needle, I let go of it, wrap my yarn around, pull it through. So to show a few more here, the bottom base, going from left to right, wrap my yarn around, pull it snug, pull it through the loop. And I'm gonna keep on going all the way across these stitches. Now, as I'm knitting too, I'm making sure both of my sets of stitches on either side now are staying close to the knitting needle points. I want to try to prevent this from happening where I stretch them out really far, because then you'll see it kind of creates as like a bar in your cast on. So you want to keep your knitting needle points close together as you're working this whole thing, and the work close to the points. Now I'm down here at my last stitch. So when I finish that, there'll be nothing left over here on the left knitting needle, so I'm just gonna put that one down. Gonna straighten out my work over here on the right. So I just knit all the way across, and that is what my work looks like there so far. And now to work the next row, I'm gonna turn my knitting needle, so now it's pointed over towards the right. My work will look a little bit different on this side, right? So you can see all the bumps right along there, just below the knitting needle. And now I'm gonna hold the knitting needle with the work on it in my left hand. Again, I'm just holding it right on top of where the knitting is. Gonna grab the free knitting needle with my right hand, hold it pretty close up there to the top. And now I'm just gonna begin knitting across the stitches again. So this is where you wanna be really careful that you aren't knitting with the tail. So this is my little yarn tail. I'm just gonna hold that off to the side so I don't accidentally start knitting with it. And now to start knitting, I'm just gonna go right into that first stitch. Again, going from the base, left to right. Wrap my yarn down below, then come up in between the two knitting needles, pull the loop through. I'm going to keep on going all the way across this set of stitches. Now I'm reaching the end of the second row, and when I reach the end, I'm just going to drop that knitting needle on the left with no stitches on it, straighten out my work again, and then flip the knitting needle with the stitches on it so that the point is going over towards the right. So I just worked 2 full rows. So each time I work across my knitting needle, that is 1 row in knitting. Now the stitch we're creating, or the stitch pattern we're creating by knitting on both sides, is called garter stitch. And what it's going to end up looking like is this right down here. So this first square that we're making right here is garter stitch, where we knit on both sides of our work. So the front and the back, and the front and the back look nearly identical. So that's what we're going for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue working that knit row over and over again until my work measures just a little above 5 inches, because I like mine to look like squares. So the way I'm going to measure it is I'm going to measure from the bottom of my stitches, or from where that cast on edge is, up until the bottom of the knitting needle. And when that's just over 5 stitches, I'm going to come back and introduce to you the next square, which is stockinette. So stockinette, we have to learn a new stitch called the purl stitch. Also, if you're interested, this afternoon I'll be releasing another video where I show you a more advanced way to hold your yarn. So if instead of dropping your knitting needle each time, so first, the way I've shown you so far, you let go of your right knitting needle, wrap your yarn around, then pick it back up and knit, put it in, drop it, wrap it around, pick it back up. Another way you can do it is by wrapping your yarn around your fingers and knitting across while holding it, so you never have to drop the yarn. I'll be putting a video out on that technique of holding your yarn this afternoon. Otherwise, I'll see you back here again tomorrow to learn the stockinette pattern.